The gavel had not even come down yet when Marcus Webb stood up from the folding chair in the third row and asked to be recognized. The board president, a woman named Denise Farrow, looked at him over the top of her reading glasses, the way a teacher looks at a student who has interrupted a lesson. Behind her, 5 other board members sat at a long table under fluorescent lights, papers stacked neatly in front of them, and beside Farrow sat a man in a gray suit named Arthur Pell, the district's director of operations, who had spent the last 11 minutes explaining, in the calm and reasonable tone of a man reading from a script, why a single father's garage constituted an unlicensed educational facility and a liability the district could no longer ignore. Marcus did not raise his voice. He never did. He said he understood the concerns. He said he had read the zoning code twice, then a third time, just to be sure he wasn't missing something. And then he said that if the board wanted to shut down a garage where 27 kids did their algebra homework and ate free sandwiches, they were welcome to try. But they should know what they were actually voting on before they voted on it. If you've ever watched someone in a position of power make a decision that had nothing to do with what was right and everything to do with what was convenient, you already know the feeling in that room. Stay with this one until the end, because what happened over the next 10 minutes is the reason this story ended up on the local news. 10 weeks earlier, none of this had a name yet. It was just a Tuesday, and Marcus Webb was driving home from the transmission shop, where he'd worked for 14 years, taking the same route he always took, past the gas station on Cedar and 9th, when he noticed the boy. The kid couldn't have been more than 11. He was sitting on the concrete curb outside the gas station, backpack open beside him, a math worksheet balanced on his knee, squinting at it in the fading light because the station's overhead lamp hadn't kicked on yet. Marcus slowed the truck without deciding to. He recognized the posture. He'd seen it before, more than once, in more than one spot around town. Kids doing homework on benches, on curbs, in the thin strip of shade behind a laundromat, because home wasn't a place where homework got done, and the library closed at 6. He pulled into the station, bought a bottle of water he didn't need, and asked the boy if he was stuck. The boy said, "Yeah." Fractions. Marcus sat down on the curb next to him in his work clothes, smelling like brake cleaner, and spent 20 minutes explaining common denominators using the boy's own shoelace as a visual aid, tying it into thirds and then into fourths, so the kid could see it instead of just hearing it. When the worksheet was done, the boy said thanks and got picked up 10 minutes later by an aunt who worked doubles at the hospital and hadn't had time to check the assignment herself. Marcus drove the rest of the way home thinking about his own daughter. Her name was Ellie, she was 9, sharp as a tack, and the reason his house ran on a schedule tighter than most Fortune 500 companies. Her mother had left when Ellie was 4, and it had been the two of them ever since, in a small house with a garage Marcus had converted over the years into something between a workshop and a den. A workbench along one wall, a shelf of tools, an old couch he'd never gotten around to throwing out, and a space heater for the months when the cold got into the concrete. That night, over dinner, Ellie asked him why he looked like he was thinking about something. He told her about the boy on the curb. She said that was sad. Then she asked if he could help kids do homework, since he was good at explaining things, better than her actual teacher. In her opinion, Marcus didn't answer right away. He finished his dinner, washed the dishes, and thought about it the way he thought about anything worth doing, slowly, and from more than one angle. Prawn. The next afternoon, he pulled a folding table out of the garage, set it up next to the workbench, put a hand-lettered sign at the end of the driveway that said, F-R-O-F-E, homework, work, help, 326, everyone, well, come, and waited to see if anyone would come. 2 kids showed up the first day. One was the boy from the gas station who'd apparently mentioned it to his cousin. The other was a girl from 2 streets over who'd seen the sign on her walk home. By the end of the second week, there were 9. By the end of the month, there were 19, and Marcus had added a second folding table, a stack of secondhand textbooks he'd picked up from a library sale, and a cooler that Ellie kept stocked with juice boxes and granola bars using her allowance, which Marcus quietly reimbursed without telling her, because she liked believing she was funding it herself. And he liked letting her believe that he never charged a dime. He never asked a parent for anything beyond a signature on a simple form that said their kid had permission to be there. A habit from a man who believed paperwork, done right, protected everyone, including him. He never advertised beyond that one sign at the end of the driveway. 2. Did the rest, the way word does in a neighborhood where everyone knows whose porch light stays on the latest and whose garage door goes up at 3 o'clock sharp, 5 days a week, rain or clear skies, without fail. The routine had a shape to it, and Marcus liked shapes. School let out. Kids trickled in over 20 minutes, backpacks thudding onto the concrete floor. He worked through math first, because math was where kids got stuck the hardest and gave up the fastest, and reading second, because reading was where the shy ones needed the quietest attention. He kept a spiral notebook, one subject per kid, a running log of what they were working on, what they'd mastered, what still needed another pass. He wasn't a teacher by training. He'd never claimed to be. But he had built engines and diagnosed problems other mechanics couldn't find for a living, and it turned out the same instinct that let him find a bad sensor in a transmission let him find exactly where a 10-year-old's understanding of long division had quietly come apart. By the 4th month, the number was 27, and it had held steady there for weeks, which told Marcus something about capacity and told the neighborhood something about trust. He didn't know, not yet, that the number 27 would end up printed in a formal complaint filed with the county, with his name and address attached to it, and the words "unlicensed operation" typed in a font that made it look more official than anything happening in his garage actually was. The complaint came from a man named Arthur Pell. Pell held the title of Director of Operations for the school district, a job that mostly involved facilities, contracts, budget line items, and, as it turned out, though nobody outside a small circle knew it yet, a private consulting arrangement with a tutoring company called Bright Path Learning Solutions, which had been quietly angling for a district-wide after-school contract for the better part of a year. Bright Path charged $40 an hour per student. Bright Path had also, not coincidentally, hired Arthur Pell's brother-in-law as a regional sales director 6 months earlier. None of that was public information yet. What was public was a single-page memo, sent to the school board and copied to the county zoning office, expressing concern about an unlicensed, unregulated, and potentially unsafe childcare operation running out of a residential garage on Larkspur Lane, with 27 minors reportedly in attendance on a regular basis. No background checks on the adults supervising them, no fire code inspection, and no liability coverage of any kind. The memo was accurate in its facts and dishonest in its framing, which was the particular skill Arthur Pell had built a career on. Marcus found out about the complaint on a Thursday when a county code enforcement officer named Ruth Alvarez knocked on his door holding a clipboard and an expression that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. She told him there'd been a complaint. She told him she had to do a walkthrough. She was polite about it, almost apologetic. And Marcus appreciated that, because he understood the difference between a person doing an unpleasant job carefully and a person doing an unpleasant job carelessly. He let her in without hesitation. Ruth walked the garage slowly. She noted the 2 fire extinguishers Marcus had mounted on the wall 2 years earlier, back when Ellie was young enough to need reminding not to touch the space heater. She noted the clearly marked exit path, the smoke detector he'd wired in himself, the sign-in sheet with parent signatures going back 4 months, the spiral notebook with individual student progress logged in his neat mechanic's handwriting. She noted that snacks were kept in a cooler with a posted allergy list, hand-copied from conversations with each parent. She told him, off the record, that she'd seen daycare centers with licenses that weren't half this organized. But the complaint existed, and the complaint had specific language in it. And specific language required a specific process, and a specific process meant the matter was now scheduled for the next school board meeting, because the memo had gone not just to the county but to the district. And the district, through Arthur Pell, had decided this was a matter for the board. Marcus asked Ruth what that meant for him. Practically, she said, honestly, that until the board ruled on it, he was in a gray area. Not illegal. Not quite legal either. A gray area, and gray areas made everyone nervous, including her. He thanked her for being straight with him. She left him a copy of the complaint on her way out. Marcus read it twice that night at the kitchen table, after Ellie had gone to bed. He read it slowly the first time, taking in the accusations one at a time. He read it a second time, to separate what was true from what was implied, the way he'd learned to separate a real diagnostic reading from a censor giving a false one. 27 minors was true. No fire inspection was true in the narrow sense that no official inspector had come out, though Marcus had built the space to code anyway, out of habit and care rather than requirement. No background checks was true. Technically, though every parent involved had known Marcus for years, had watched their kids come home able to do their homework for the first time, and had never once been asked to hand over a dime. What the memo didn't say was that not one child had ever been hurt, not one parent had ever complained, not $1 had ever changed hands. He folded the paper and set it on the counter, and he didn't sleep especially well that night, though he didn't tell Ellie that. The next morning he called a woman named Corinne Fisk. Corinne had been a paralegal for 11 years before switching to substitute teaching, and her daughter Priya had been coming to the garage since the second week. Corinne had a lawyer's eye for language even without the license, and when Marcus read her the complaint over the phone, she went quiet for a second and then said one sentence that stuck with him for days. She said, "This isn't about safety. This is about somebody's money." Marcus didn't know yet how right she was, but he trusted her instinct because Corinne was the kind of person who double-checked things before she said them out loud, and she didn't say things like that lightly. Over the next week, word of the complaint moved through the neighborhood the same way word of the tutoring had moved through it months earlier, quietly, person to person, but this time carrying a current of something closer to anger than curiosity. Parents started showing up, not to drop off kids, but to ask questions. What did this mean? Was Marcus in trouble? Was the garage going to close? Marcus answered, honestly every time. He didn't know yet. There was a meeting scheduled, and he intended to go to it and explain himself, calmly, with whatever paperwork he had. He did not intend to beg. That was not in his nature, and it had never once served him well when he tried it. The board meeting was set for a Tuesday night, 7 o'clock, at the district administration building, in a beige conference room with stackable chairs and a podium that had clearly been purchased sometime in the previous decade. Marcus arrived 20 minutes early with a folder under his arm containing every sign-in sheet, every progress log, a photo of the fire extinguishers, and a copy of Ruth Alvarez's informal notes, which she'd given him without being asked, because she told him plainly that she thought the complaint was a waste of the county's time and hers. What Marcus did not expect, walking in, was the number of people already seated. The room, built for maybe 40, had closer to 90 bodies in it, spilling into the hallway, parents standing along the back wall with arms crossed, a few kids sitting cross-legged on the floor near the door because there weren't enough chairs left. Corinne Fisk had spent the week making calls. So had half a dozen other parents, independently, without coordinating, because it turned out that a room full of people who'd watched their kids' grades improve for free didn't need much convincing to show up and say so. Denise Farrow gaveled the meeting to order at 7 sharp and moved through 2 routine budget items before reaching the agenda line that everyone in the room had actually come for. Item 6. Review of Unlicensed Community Tutoring Operation. Larkspur Lane. Arthur Pell stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked to the podium with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once been told no in a room like this. He began by thanking the board for its time. He said the matter before them was, at its core, simple. A matter of liability, licensing, and the district's responsibility to protect minors, regardless of the good intentions of the individual involved. He used the phrase good intentions twice in his opening minute, and both times it came out sounding like a diagnosis, rather than a compliment. He said that while he did not doubt Mr. Webb's sincerity was not a substitute for proper oversight. He said that 27 unsupervised minors, he used the word unsupervised, though every parent in the room knew it was false, represented a serious liability exposure for the district and the county. Both, given the site's proximity to district-zoned residential streets, and its function as what he called a de facto educational institution, operating with 0 licensing, 0 background checks, and 0 insurance. He recommended the board issue immediate cease and desist, pending a full zoning and safety review that could, he noted, take upward of 90 days. And then, almost as an aside, he mentioned that the district had, fortuitously, already been in conversation with a fully licensed and insured tutoring provider, BrightPath Learning Solutions, that could step in immediately to serve displaced students at, he said, a modest and heavily subsidized rate. He did not mention his brother-in-law. He did not mention the consulting fee. He said the words modest and subsidized as though they were facts rather than marketing language, and he sat back down, looking like a man who believed the matter was already settled. That was when Marcus stood. He walked to the podium without hurrying, set his folder down, and opened it to the first page before he said a single word, which was a habit from years of walking into a customer's garage bay and letting the diagnostic printout speak before he did. He said, "Good evening." He said his name was Marcus Webb, and he lived on Larkspur Lane, and for the last 4 months, kids in this district had been doing their homework in his garage, after school, for free, because a lot of them didn't have anywhere else that was quiet, safe, and staffed by someone who could actually explain the material. He said he'd read the complaint twice, and then a third time. He said he wanted to go through it, point by point, because he thought the board deserved the full picture, not just the parts that had been typed up for them. He held up the sign-in log, every session, every date, every parent's signature, going back 17 weeks. He held up the spiral notebook, 27 names, 27 individual academic logs, tracking exactly what each child had struggled with and what they'd since mastered. Fractions, long division, reading comprehension, one boy's stutter easing. Session by session, as he grew more comfortable reading out loud in a room where nobody laughed at him. He held up the photo of the fire extinguishers, the wiring diagram for the smoke detector he'd installed himself, and Ruth Alvarez's own handwritten notes, which stated plainly that the space met or exceeded most licensed daycare safety standards she'd personally inspected, despite having no legal obligation to meet any standard at all. He said the complaint used the word unsupervised. He said he had personally supervised every single session, every single day, without exception, for 17 weeks. He said the complaint used the word unsafe. He said not one child had ever so much as skinned a knee in that garage, and he invited any parent in the room to say otherwise right now, out loud. Nobody did. He said he understood the district had a responsibility to make sure kids were safe. He said he shared that responsibility and had been meeting it quietly for free since before anyone at this table knew his name. Then he looked directly at Arthur Pell, and his voice didn't rise at all when he said the next part, which was somehow worse for Pell than if it had. He said he'd also done some reading on BrightPath Learning Solutions over the past week. He said the company had incorporated 14 months ago. He said its listed regional sales director shared a last name with Arthur Pell's wife, and a quick public record search showed the two men were in fact brothers-in-law. He said BrightPath's proposed subsidized rate, as advertised on its own public pricing sheet, was $28 an hour per student, which for 27 kids, 5 days a week, worked out to just under $4,000 a week, or roughly $200,000 a year. Paid out of a district budget that had cut 2 elementary art programs the previous spring for lack of funds. The room, which had been quiet, went quieter. Marcus said he wasn't a lawyer. He said he wasn't an accountant either. He said he was a mechanic, and what he knew about mechanics was that when something didn't run right, you didn't guess at the cause, you traced the wiring until you found exactly where the short was. He said he'd traced this one, and he thought the board should know exactly what they were being asked to approve, and exactly who stood to profit from shutting his garage down. Arthur Pell stood up fast enough that his chair scraped against the tile and said this was a personal attack, unsubstantiated, and entirely inappropriate for a public meeting, and that Mr. Taos Webb should be made to leave the podium immediately. Denise Farrow did not immediately agree with him. She was looking at Marcus's folder still open on the podium at the neat rows of dates and signatures. And then she was looking at Arthur Pell, and something in her face had shifted in the last 90 seconds in a way that suggested she was doing quiet arithmetic of her own. She asked Marcus if he had documentation for the claim about BrightPath's ownership structure and Pell's relationship to it. Marcus said yes and passed forward 3 printed pages, a state business registration filing, a LinkedIn profile for the regional sales director listing the same last name and the same hometown as Arthur Pell's own public bio, and the Bright Path pricing sheet, publicly posted on the company's own website, downloaded and dated that morning. He said he'd made copies for each board member and for anyone in the room who wanted one, and a stack of them was sitting on the table by the door. Denise Farrow took a long moment reading the first page, then the second. Then she looked up, not at Marcus, but at Arthur Pell, and asked him, in a voice that had lost its earlier warmth entirely, whether he intended to disclose any financial or familial relationship to Bright Path Learning Solutions before recommending the district enter into a contract with them. Pell said the relationship, if it existed at all, which he wasn't certain it did, was entirely incidental and had no bearing on his professional recommendation, which was based solely on licensing and liability concerns. Barrow said that was going to need to be reviewed by district council before any further action was taken on item 6. She said the cease and desist recommendation was effective immediately. Tabled. She said the board would be scheduling a separate closed session to review Mr. Pell's disclosure obligations under the district's conflict of interest policy, a policy which she noted every district employee signed annually, including. She checked a paper in front of her, Arthur Pell, 11 months earlier. The room did not erupt. It didn't need to. 90 people sat in near total silence, watching a man in a gray suit go visibly, physically smaller in the space of about 45 seconds, without anyone raising their voice at all. Pell said something about needing to consult with his own attorney before continuing, gathered his papers with hands that weren't quite steady, and left the room before the meeting had even formally adjourned that agenda item. Nobody stopped him. The rest of the meeting moved quickly. A woman from the county zoning office, who'd apparently been quietly informed of the situation by Ruth Alvarez earlier that week, stood and stated for the record that a residential accessory structure used for free non-commercial community tutoring with no fees charged and no formal enrollment contract likely fell outside the zoning code's definition of a licensed care facility altogether, and that the county would need to formally review the classification, but saw no urgent liability concern requiring immediate closure. Denise Farrow thanked Marcus for his time and his documentation. She said the board would follow up in writing within 2 weeks regarding the zoning classification and any recommendations going forward. Marcus closed his folder, said, "Thank you," and walked back to his seat, and Corinne Fisk, sitting 2 rows back, reached out and squeezed his arm once as he passed, and didn't say anything, because there wasn't really anything left to say. The formal write-up came 11 days later. It was 3 pages, signed by Denise Farrow, and it did 3 things. It classified the Larkspur Lane tutoring program as a private, non-commercial community activity, exempt from the licensing requirements that applied to formal child care or educational businesses, provided Marcus continued to maintain basic safety standards, which he'd already exceeded for a year. It formally rejected the district's proposed contract with Bright Path Learning Solutions, citing an active and ongoing conflict of interest investigation involving Arthur Pell, who had by then been placed on unpaid administrative leave pending a full review by the district's ethics office and, separately, the county. And it offered Marcus something he hadn't asked for and hadn't expected: a modest annual stipend paid out of a small community partnership fund the district had never previously used for anything, along with an offer to formally partner the garage program with 2 elementary schools as an approved off-site enrichment resource, which would let Marcus request donated books and supplies through the district without giving up an ounce of control over how the program ran. Marcus read the letter twice at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd read the original complaint 11 days earlier, and the second reading felt different than the first had. Slower, steadier. Ellie asked him what it said. He told her the garage was staying open. He told her the district was even going to help now, a little, if he wanted the help. She asked if that meant more kids could come. He said maybe. He said he'd have to think about the space. He said maybe they'd need a second garage someday, or a room at the community center, but for now, the driveway sign could stay exactly where it was. She said, "Good." Then she went back to her own homework, because to Ellie, this had never really been a complicated story. Somebody needed help. Her dad was good at helping. The rest, to her, was just noise that grown-ups made around a simple fact. Arthur Pell's story ended less quietly. Though it ended in roughly the same amount of time, it takes most quiet stories to end, not with a dramatic public firing, but with a short paragraph in the district's board minutes 2 months later, noting that his position had been terminated for cause following the conclusion of an ethics investigation, and that the district would be reviewing its vendor disclosure policies going forward. Bright Path Learning Solutions quietly withdrew its proposal to the district a week after that, and, as far as anyone in the neighborhood ever heard, never resurfaced in that county again. Denise Farrow visited the garage herself about a month after the meeting, on a Wednesday afternoon, unannounced, in plain clothes rather than the blazer she'd worn at the podium. She said she'd wanted to see it in person, not on paper. She stood near the doorway for a while, watching Marcus help a boy work through a word problem about a train and a distance and a speed, watching him ask questions instead of giving answers, watching the boy's face change when he got there on his own. She told Marcus on her way out that she'd sat on that board for 6 years and approved more contracts, more consultants, and more programs than she could count, and none of them had ever done what she just watched happen in 20 minutes on a folding chair in somebody's garage. Marcus said he appreciated that. He didn't say much else because he'd never been a man who needed to fill a silence just because one existed. She came back a few weeks after that, this time with a box of second-hand library books the district had cleared out of storage, and stayed for coffee afterward, out on the driveway, while Ellie showed her a science project involving a baking soda volcano that had notably stained one corner of the garage floor, a pale gray that never quite came out. Farrow said she didn't mind the stain. She said some stains were worth having. By the time the local news picked up the story, most of it was already old news to the neighborhood. The segment ran 2 months after the board meeting, a 5-minute piece about a single dad's garage tutoring program that had, in the reporter's words, quietly forced a school district to confront a conflict of interest it might otherwise never have found. The reporter asked Marcus, on camera, why he'd done any of it in the first place, why he'd kept the sign up every single day for months before anyone official even noticed. Marcus thought about it for a second before answering, the way he thought about most things. He said a kid doing homework on a curb outside a gas station isn't a policy problem. It's just a kid who needs a table and a little bit of quiet and someone willing to sit down next to him. He said everything else, the complaint, the meeting, the paperwork, that was just noise that showed up later, trying to make something simple sound complicated. He said the garage door still went up every weekday at 3 o'clock. It always had. It still did. The reporter asked if that would ever change. Marcus said, probably not. The segment closed on a wide shot of the driveway at dusk, the folding tables full, the sign at the end of the drive lit faintly by a porch light, and somewhere in the middle of the frame, a 9-year-old girl handing out juice boxes from a cooler she still believed entirely that she had paid for herself. Some things, Marcus figured, were better left exactly that way.